if you choose, by going to your control panel, and then you can follow along by printing out the PowerPoints if you'd wish. With those comments, I want to welcome again our co-host, Mike Hutchins, down at the University of Illinois, our good partner in this series, and his partner down there, Jim Baltz, who takes care of a lot of the technical things for us. Patty Hurchin on the Hordes Dairyman staff up here takes care of a lot of details as well. And with those comments, I welcome you all to our webinar today, an update on raising better calves. The sponsor is De Laval. We certainly appreciate their support. And Mike, Dr. Mike Hutchins, with those comments, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce our presenter and get us going.
Well, very good, Steve. And it's my professional and personal pleasure to introduce Dr. Bob James, who will be our webinar leader here today. Bob got his bachelor's degree at the University of Delaware, and then went on and got his master's and PhD at Virginia Polytech State University, as far as that goes. And then spent 3 years as an extension specialist at West Virginia University, and in 1980 joined the staff at the Virginia Polytech Institute and progressed to the various assistant, associate, and full professor. We're congratulate Bob. He retired July 1st, he was the extension project leader there in the Department of Dairy Science as well. He received a prestigious award, the University Academy of Teaching Excellence Award in 2010, and he is a founding member of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, which is a very influential group and really targets our topic here today. And he has served as conference chairman several times, including 2016 and 2017 conferences. Bob has made presentations to 29 U.S. states, Canada, South America, and Europe. So, Bob, we're very pleased that you were willing to take time from your busy schedule to join us here today, and we'll turn the program over to you on your topic on updates on raising better calves. Dr. James, the program is yours.
Okay, thanks an awful lot. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody. What I'd like to do is to kind of set the stage a little bit and talk about, we're going to focus on some critical control points, what I believe in calves, colostrum, feeding calves to meet their nutrient requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about labor, and then also calf welfare, and provide as relevant some updates of some new information I think of practical significance. But let's kind of set the stage. You know, we're in a rather challenging economic climate right now. And I think our priorities for spending on the dairy tend to be cost-cutting. They tend to be directed towards the milking herd. I think we really need to recognize that it's a cyclical nature of the dairy financial climate. We have ups and downs. And it's important to remember that the calf program has a long-term impact on morbidity, on mortality, and really the future productivity of that herd. So what we do now is going to have an impact on things, hopefully when the dairy industry turns around and things are better. My point is that we need to establish some priorities for that calf enterprise to really optimize our returns and really focus on those things that are going to return the most money. As we look at, what's success, I think we have different perspectives. We have the perspective from the owner, which is probably trying to minimize some of our costs, but let's not forget the feeder as well, and because that's the person who's actually out there where the dirt meets the boots, so to speak. But probably the most important one is going to be that calf, and I think we need to establish those priorities. Traditionally, we've looked at colostrum just really in getting antibodies in that calf early in life, or immune globulins. Our calf feeding historically has been, let's try and wean this calf as soon as we can by limiting liquid feed so that they really make them hungry, and try and get them eating dry feed sooner. By and large, most calves have been housed individually because we focus on limiting disease transmission, and we've looked at low cost. Well, I think we would need to change some of those views. On my updates today, we're going to talk a little bit more about just the antibodies and the immune globulins. We're going to look at changing our focus on the feeding program to meeting the nutrient requirements for growth and adopting the same mindset as we use for feeding the lactating herd. If I limited dry matter intake to the milking herd, they wouldn't milk very well. Well, if I limit to these calves, they're not going to grow very well, and I think we need to develop that same mindset. We also need to be concerned about the labor, because a lot of times it's hard labor, it's a different skill set, and what's the environment for that labor? Are they out in the hot sun, the cold wind? That's important for the labor as well as for feeding calves. And then finally is the welfare component, the social development of these calves and consumer perceptions. There's been some great animal behavior work that's been done, which is what we really need to define scientifically what's going to be best for that animal, rather than strictly some surface perceptions. Well, no one wants to talk about colostrum. In fact, if I asked people about colostrum, they could report rhyme and verse what we need to do, and that's feed a gallon of high IgG or high antibody colostrum early in life, and it ought to be clean. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the clean side here in just a few minutes. I want to begin by really looking at some great work that came out of the University of Florida by Dr. Jeff Dahl and some of his co-workers, and they looked at heat-stressed cows during the dry period, or those that had been cooled during the dry period, and this was just really for a rather limited 7 to 10 day period. And they found that those calves that came from heat-stressed dams had lower birth weight, they were shorter at weaning, they had poor colostrum absorption efficiency. They really didn't achieve the weight or the height of the dams or the calves born from cooled dams. They took more services per conception, and they had quite a bit less milk. That's about 10 pounds less milk per day through the first 35 days of that first lactation. And so that's a real large consideration. And again, remember, we're dealing with some pretty extreme heat stress down there in Florida with both heat and humidity. Now, in shifting gears here a little bit, let's imagine what this newborn calf is like. This calf is sterile at birth, and almost immediately bacteria start colonizing that animal, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and this really can influence colostrum absorption. This microbial colonization of the gut is very rapid. It's by anaerobic bacteria. Some of these bacteria live in the lumen and some of them in the intestinal lining, and they're going to have an impact on later growth, on health, and possibly on later performance by these calves. I think that's illustrated real well in some work that was done some time ago. And we've got two micrographs here. The one on the right is the intestinal epithelium of a colostrum-fed calf. And look at that beautiful brush border up there. These dark areas right here really represent absorbed antibodies. And this is a calf that was fed colostrum very early in life. And let's compare that to the one on the left, which is a higher degree of magnification. But this is a colostrum-deprived calf. And those large are actually bacteria that are trying to be absorbed by that intestinal epithelial cell. And quite frankly, they cause a great deal of trauma to that tissue and really have a negative impact on absorption. Now, what is the sources of those bacterial contamination? Well, they could be the calving environment, nursing an unclean teat, collecting colostrum into unclean containers and not feeding it quickly or cooling it quickly if we don't feed it right away, or possibly contaminated or dirty bottles or esophageal feeders. And I think as we look at those things on the farm, there's a lot of potential for bacterial contamination. In fact, if we look at some of the work that was done at the University of Minnesota, they found that the average, I'm going to back up here a little bit, they found that the average bacterial levels of colostrum in Minnesota were considerably above our goal of about 50 to 100,000 bacteria per ml. Now, if we look beyond bacteria, there are higher levels of hormones, there are higher levels of some cytokines and some white blood cells that are also in this colostrum. And that's, I think, the possible influence of some of these other things is shown in two slides. The one on the left represents some work that was done in Europe, and we compared calves that were either fed colostrum or transition milk, or just strictly milk replacer from birth until the first 4 days of life. So if we look under 2 hours after we fed those calves, the calves that were fed colostrum had higher levels of blood glucose compared to those that had that were fed strictly milk replacer. We look at that figure on the right, and we look at the height of the villi, or the projections in that intestine. They're taller in the calves that were fed colostrum as compared to those that were fed milk replacer. Now, the next thing that's really interesting is, and we're going to shift on down to looking at these maternal cells in colostrum. There are white blood cells that are present in colostrum. We know that they migrate across that calf intestine during that first feeding. They're found in calf tissues. They enhance some activation markers on peripheral blood leukocytes. They enhance pathogen clearance, and then some work that we just finished here at Virginia Tech, they enhance the response to vaccination as heifers. In this study, we fed either fresh or flash frozen colostrum from the calf's dam to those calves. Now, flash freezing disrupts those white blood cells and kind of kills most of them. And so the calves that got the fresh colostrum from their dam had a significantly improved vaccination response than those that got the frozen colostrum. Now we have a polling question. So I'm a little bit unfamiliar, but the poll's open, and so we're going to ask you to click in. But what are the benefits of feeding the dam's colostrum fresh to her calf? First one is improved immune function. Second is improved development of intestinal tissue. Third is better growth and health of that calf. And the fourth one, or D, would be all the above. So go ahead and click in on that, and let's see your responses.
Well, Steve, are you ready to vote?
Yeah, I'm going to go with all of the above. Seems like the safe bet in this case, and based on what Bob has told us so far. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right on that, Steve. Finally, you got to think one question right. I'm a little nervous about you the last couple of weeks, but webinars, I should say. But looks like, Jim, let's close her. We're at 83%. We got a good vote.
Okay, it sounds like we had 95% said all of the above, so folks must be listening well this morning. We've had our lunch. I've already had the lunch here in the Eastern time zone, so I'm trying to fight off those effects of my postprandial glucose. But anyway, yes, we show the summary here, the benefits of feeding that colostrum and prolonged feeding of colostrum. Better immune function. It seems like we get some benefit of that intestinal tissue, and we get better growth and health of those calves. My challenge is, I think we've talked about colostrum for so long, and I think we have enough challenges of just getting some good, fresh, clean, first milking colostrum into our calves. How do we implement this next stage? How do we separate milk from second and later milkings, and that's unsaleable milk, and collect that, and then feed that colostrum or that transition milk to those younger calves? And I think that's a matter of facilities and protocols, and that can be rather challenging. But there are some potential benefits from that, and I'd like to think that some progressive producers will figure out a way to get that done on the farm. So, achieving success in colostrum management, my checklist, a lot of the problems that we have on the farm, I think, are people and facilities problems. Where are the close-up cows? Where do they calve? Where are fresh cows milked, and where are calves housed? Think about that on each farm that you, either if it's your own farm or one that you work with. For that calving management, you want frequent, convenient observation. That can be challenging on a smaller farm, so that convenient has got to be underlined. I want a clean environment, well-bedded, clean, with straw preferably, and timely feeding of colostrum. Then we look at the colostrum management to harvest it into clean containers, and either it gets cooled or fed in the first hour. If we're not going to feed it, then we need to have some frozen bottles of water that we can drop down into that container, clean bottles, to get it flash cool. Just putting it in the refrigerator is not going to get it done. and so we need to cool it quickly. I need clean feeding equipment. Bottles, esophageal feeder. This is as clean as our milking equipment that we have for the cows. So I want a low bacteria colostrum. It ought to have less than 50,000 standard plate count. We can use the Brix refractometer for measuring potential IgG content, and that ought to be over 22, and potentially we can pasteurize that if there are some risks involved. And then look at the people. Who's responsible at calving? Who's responsible for colostrum harvest, colostrum feeding, and calf housing? Do they communicate, and how well is that coordinated? Now, obviously, there are a lot of potential problems on farms. And so my only point here is I think that there are roles for colostrum replacers on farms, and we use some of those at Virginia Tech when some of those other things are not optimal and we just can't get it done from either a facilities or a personnel problem. We do use some of the colostrum replacers, and there are some very good ones out there. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about this pre-weaned calf. This is normal biology. Okay, this calf's sucking on the dam. Now, I think historically we've been really afraid to feed this young calf larger quantities of calf. We're afraid they're going to get diarrhea or get a digestive upset, and if we feed them too much. Well, here's some work with beef cattle. And an Angus calf at the end of week 1 is going to eat 6.6 quarts. And by week 6 is up to about 10.6, and their average daily gains are going to be about 1.2 to 2.1 pounds. And so this is normal biology. Now let's talk about meeting that calf's nutrient requirements. They have requirements for maintenance, and that's existing just where they are. Not gaining weight, not losing. That's influenced by environment, by moisture, by wind, by their hair coat. In other words, not losing energy to the environment. The second part of that is how much do you want that calf to grow in week 1, week 2, week 3? And really, what is growth? Some of you are probably gaining weight right now because you're eating lunch, okay? But growth is actually a change in body composition, in protein and fat, and we have to make sure that it's not confused with fill, which is just the weight of the feed that's being consumed and when we weigh that animal. I showed this. This was a study done at Virginia Tech, and on this graph over on the right-hand side here, where we limit fed Holstein males or females, or Jersey males or females, and they were fed, the Holsteins were fed 4 quarts a day, the Jerseys were just a little bit less than that. And what I want you to focus on is look at that growth during the first 15 days of life. They weren't growing at all. They weren't growing at all. And then we started to see some gradual growth. Well, guess what? They started eating calf starter. And so was it really growth, or was it actually just some growth and fill? My point is that these calves during the first 3 to 4 weeks of life are not going to eat very much calf starter. And I think we've been ignoring a very, very critical stage of that calf's growth. So our next polling question, and that is, and this one we haven't talked about yet, but how much milk would a 110-pound calf need to drink to meet her maintenance requirements if it was 32 degrees Fahrenheit? 2 pounds, 4 pounds, 6 pounds, or more than 8 pounds. And to give a little reference, about 8.6 pounds is what a gallon of milk will weigh.
Oh boy. Here we go, Steve.
You want me to go first again?
Yeah, I'll let you go first. I'm probably going to vote. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm going to go with more than 8, actually.
Well, I'm kind of torn over here because he's got that word maintenance, so no growth in there, and he's at.
Oh yeah, just maintenance, yeah. Oh yeah.
But it's pretty cold. 32 degrees Fahrenheit's pretty cold.
Boy, people are voting fast today. They're getting ready for November. I can see that.
Yeah, I'm going to go for 8 pounds too. That coldness really scares me. That 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The daylight outside of me here, so I'll go there as well.
Okay.
Hey, Dan, let's kick off. What do we got? What do you think, Bob?
Okay, we're going to go on to the next slide here, and here's the amount of milk needed to meet maintenance requirements. And so if we look at that 110-pound calf at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to need 9.4 pounds or more than a gallon just to make. Now, we're not going to get any growth at all with that calf. No growth at all. And so when we think about that and we're concerned about overfeeding calves, we've got some real serious concerns there. We've got some real serious concerns. Now I've got a little question mark up here around the 55, and that would be my Jersey calf. I'm a little bit prone to jerseys because we've done a lot of work there, and it says I need 5.6 pounds. I'm going to tell you that this is the 2001 NRC. Probably the new one, you're going to see that be higher because we've shown some work that actually proportionately these little calves lose heat more quickly than some of the larger ones do. Now let's look at this a little bit differently, and I'm going to compare. This is energy allowable gain if a calf was fed either whole milk or a 20/20 milk replacer. Now 20/20 has been kind of our standard all along. If we put whole milk on a powder basis, it's going to be about probably 25–26% protein and 28 to maybe 32% fat. And so why do we have a 20/20? Well, probably because it's less cost and we can get calves eating grain a little bit sooner. But anyway, this 80-pound calf, a pound of dry matter, which is going to be about a gallon of milk, we've got enough energy to support 0.85 pounds of gain at 68 degrees, and they're still going to grow a little bit at 32. But look at what happens to this calf at 20/20. They're going to lose weight. They're going to lose weight, and that's a real serious problem. Now, if we increase that from 4 quarts to about 6 quarts a day, we've got enough energy in there to let them continue to grow. Now, additional challenges, what if it's less than 32? I know it doesn't get very cold up in Minnesota very much, or Wisconsin. What if the bedding is not adequate and it's a little bit wet and that hair coat's lying down? We've got even more serious problems that we have. What about pasteurized waste milk? So why don't we feed waste milk? Well, that can be a very good feed. I'm going to tell you, based upon some work that we've done and some work that's done in Wisconsin, there's about a 10% failure rate on that pasteurizer if we're not monitoring it successfully. There's some very good pasteurizers out there, but it's like any piece of equipment, we've got to make sure it's operating properly. Then we have to handle that pasteurized milk to avoid contamination after it's been pasteurized. The supply of unsaleable milk is extremely variable. So if you have a situation where you have enough unsaleable milk to meet all your needs, you've got some very serious health problems on the farm, and you need to have a long conversation with your veterinarian. Then we have a piece of equipment to manage, managing that pasteurizer, the sanitation, and make sure it's up to operating specs. And we talk about, oh, we've got free waste milk. Well, it costs you money to produce that. And so I think one of our goals, separate from feeding calves, is to really try and minimize the amount of unsaleable milk that we have on the farm, because that is a real loss in income. My point is, pre-weaned calves have to get more than 4 quarts a day from milk or milk replacer, particularly during the first 3 weeks of age. Now, that's a challenge to feed more than 6 quarts, and particularly if we're not on a 12 and 12 and we're only feeding twice a day, because these calves may drink that morning feeding if we're feeding more than 2 or 3 quarts. But boy, in the afternoon, they still might be a little full, particularly if it's a short interval. So as this calf will show you right here, if you can look close enough, it's saying feed me. And we need to change our ideas about feeding the calves, and particularly these young calves. So we've talked a little bit about nutrition. We're going to shift into this next phase, which combines several things. And that's our feeding systems, of feed delivery, of housing, of animal welfare, and also labor. They're all interconnected very much. If we look at feed delivery, a lot of people have fed with buckets. Well, I'm going to tell you that feeding animals in buckets is very slow, particularly for a larger herd. It's a very slow delivery. And how accurate are you in delivering that milk on a daily basis? Is it measured out, or we have some type of a jug that we put in that container and we're slopping it into that bucket? Do we have a separate bucket that we use for water and one for milk? If we don't, in a lot of places, we're sharing that bucket. So sometimes we wind up with milky water or watery milk. And what I will say is that if you're putting water back into that milk bucket after you have fed milk that day, you're going to have some very high bacteria counts. You know, we've looked at that at Virginia Tech, and we've seen as high as well up into the millions on standard plate counts, and we can get some coliform counts that are really quite high. So I think that's something that we want to avoid. If we are on a bucket system, make sure we're delivering it accurately by some type of a metering system, and that we've got a separate bucket for our water and a separate bucket for our milk. And that can present some challenges. If you go to a lot of larger farms, particularly out in the West, they're going to use bottles, and they'll have large bottle wagons, and working with producers out there really changed my ideas about bottles. And so traditionally they were 2 quarts, which if you fill one all the way to the very, very top is about 2.3 quarts, or 3, and now there's even 4-quart bottles. And again, we're into the challenges we have with the bottles, and that interval between feeding can present some challenges for us. Particularly we're at a high feeding rate. If we're above 6 quarts a day, that really young calf that's a week or 2 weeks of age is going to have a challenge eating their allotment after that short interval. The other thing that I hadn't mentioned about the bottles that I really like is I can tell that feeder to fill the bottle to the top. And it's very, very uniform, and it's easy to do, and I think we can get a lot more consistency in feeding those calves with bottles. Now there's another system, and this comes from Forster Technik. It's a German company, and that's the calf rail system, and this is pretty sophisticated, and it's probably more popular in Europe. I think there's a few installations in Canada. This is a computer-controlled individual calf feeding system where we can have feeding plans with amount per day, amount per feeding. We can have this machine mix up the milk, or it will also feed waste milk, but where we control the concentration of those solids, and we can feed up to 8 times a day, and that machine will track down in front of a row of individual calf pens. So that is, albeit that it is going to be a cost that's involved in doing that. So what about feeding 3 times a day? And you'll say, well, you know, there's a university person talking about that, and they're not involved with feeding or getting up for that night feeding. But some larger herds have done this. Some larger herds have done this. And this is a nice study that was done actually at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center by Sockett and other co-workers. These calves were fed the same amount of feed per day. Excuse me. Either 3 times a day or twice a day. And if we looked at over 42 days, they gained almost 5 kilograms more if they were fed 3 times a day. They were taller, and 5 kilograms is going to be almost 10 pounds more. Their feed efficiency was higher. In other words, they got more gain per unit of feed. They weaned 2 more calves, and they had 6 more animals entering the milking string. Now, when we looked at their age at first calving, it's going to be rather similar, and this was not statistically different. And even though they made, 500 kilograms more milk, this was not statistically different. But we had better feed efficiency, and we weaned 2 more animals out of that group. If we look at a study that was done at the University of British Columbia, and this kind of goes countercurrent to I think a lot of our traditional thoughts of individually housing calves. So again, these calves were fed similarly, and they were either reared in individual pens throughout the study, or reared individually and then paired with another calf at about 6 days of age. And all they did was to lift out the divider between those 2 calves. So they had the same amount of square footage per calf. The last treatment was they were reared individually and then paired with another calf at 43 days of age. So these were late paired. 8 liters of milk for 4 weeks, then 6 liters until 7 weeks, then they weaned them gradually by 8 weeks. 21% protein calf starter. They were fed a TMR, also of corn silage, grass silage, alfalfa hay, and concentrate mix. Now the early paired calves, we can see this is total solid dry matter intake, and this is the age of the calf. Those early paired calves ate more earlier in life than those that were late paired and those that were individual. They kind of learned from each other. If we look at average daily gain, again, they're growing really pretty well. These are gaining over 1 kilogram a day, over 2 pounds a day. as compared to those that were individual and late paired, and these there was no significant difference in their average daily gains. So, you know, what they found is that these early paired calves consumed solid feed earlier. They had no difference in TMR intake, but this is the higher energy, higher nutrient feed. The big thing was that, and this was for both the early and the late paired calves, they had less of a growth check. We all know that on individually housed calves, when we pull them out, when we wean them and put them into a group, they'll tend to step back a little bit. Some of them will lose weight, but there was less of a growth check. Again, as I pointed out, there's sufficient resting area. It was the same amount per calf. And so there's probably some social factors influence intake. And in their study, there was no difference in disease. And, you know, possibly this was due to better nutrition, possibly due to a social, less stress on these calves, and possibly on disease resistance. You have to say that there are risks involved there. Everything involves some risks. Now, we're going to look at group housing systems, and that can be either with a mob feeder, with an automatic calf feeder, or this symbol, this is actually a freezer chest over on the right, where we have put barrels of acidified milk and nipples where calves can have free choice access to feed. So why group housing? Well, I think there's an opportunity for higher daily liquid feeding rates. There are some potential opportunities for improved labor efficiency, for better working conditions for calf feeders. We know that calf hutches we all know that they're great for calves, but what about the feeder when it's 20 degrees, blowing wind and snow, or at least in the southeast where it's 95 degrees and 90% humidity? What's the objective of that calf feeder? And that's really to get done as soon as they can, because it's a lousy environment. Now, I want to emphasize throughout here that each one of these systems has advantages and limitations, and so each one can be managed. Some prerequisites: you have to have a good colostrum program, high IgG, low bacteria count, early consumption. You know, when I encounter a farm that has a health problem, I want to measure serum proteins in calves and see how they stack up to really identify, do we have a colostrum problem on the farm before we do anything at all. We need a good dry cow program, and that means nutrition and vaccination. I want a great calving environment, and then we're going to house these calves individually for, you know, I've seen as low as 1 or 2 days to as high as 2 weeks, but I think, you know, a good goal probably is somewhere between 3 to 5 days till we make sure that calf is got good intake and is ready to move into a group. Some other prerequisites: you got to have good ventilation. And these pictures right here at the Virginia Tech facility we just moved into a little over a year ago. We've got a tube ventilation across the top. We actually have fans that blow during the summertime to increase our air movement, and so we've got great ventilation. We need sufficient square footage per calf, at least 35 square feet per calf. It should be well drained and bedded, and really sanitized as well as we can. Since these calves are in groups, I want some people that have some observational skills and are sensitive to calf health problems. They're the ones that can pick out that calf is off just a little bit. Some people have that skill and some don't. And I think this is extremely important in these types of systems. And they must take aggressive and early response to disease when they see it. Mob feeders. You know, this started out with barrels. In this situation here, we pulled this barrel into this pen of Jersey calves, and they can drink all that they want. There's some real potential advantages of labor efficiency. A concern that I have is we really don't know what some of these calves are consuming, and just because they're sucking on the nipple may not necessarily mean that they're consuming large quantities. These can be a real challenge for sanitation. Those milk hoses are long, they're impossible to clean, and don't be fooled by thinking that, oh, those are all good bacteria growing in there. At lower feeding rates, if we're talking about feeding probably 4 or 5 quarts or less on the average to those calves will cross-suck each other. They're going to suck each other. The other thing that will happen is if we pull that barrel out of that pen quickly, right after they've emptied it, they are going to suck each other. They're not finished. These are Jerseys, by the way, and they have oral problems. Now I show you on the right over here is a calf bar, and on this farm this has been extremely successful. What you don't see is there's a feeder on the other side of this gate, and he's supervising those calves while they're drinking it and make sure that one calf doesn't become too dominant on that system. And after they were fed, they've done a great job of cleaning this thing up and sanitizing it. So those are some important things with those mob feeders. Well, the Canadians have done some work with free-choid acidified milk. So we're adding acid. In this case, there's a barrel there. We've added acid to milk or to milk replacer, and that's 1 part formic to 9 parts of water, and so we can reduce that. Some cautions. Formic acid is a dangerous compound. You're buying this at 85%, and it takes some care and handling. And I want to really emphasize that formic acid is illegal in the U.S. These calves, once they adjust to that acidified milk, they'll drink 12 and even more quarts per calf per day.
Just wanted to chime in here. On the group housing there, our calves at the Horse Dairyman farm are raised in groups of 8 each, and there are some custom-made lockups actually that they go into during the feeding time, and then restrain there for a short period of time and kind of get over the sucking part of it. So it's a little twist on what you were showing there, but something that seems to work pretty well for us anyway.
Yeah, thanks so much, and I agree with that. I've seen a system very similar to that on a dairy right outside of Fort Atkinson, and they'll leave them their jerseys, and they'll leave them in the lockups until they've, quite frankly, got tired of sucking. And they are feeding rather high levels of milk, and so I think they're satisfied nutritionally. I'm showing a picture here, though, and it's a little bit of a different twist. And on this farm, they've used a pre-mixed acidified milk replacer. It's commercially available. It's a blend of organic acids, so we're buying something where we know of uniform nutrient and acid content, what we're going to get if we follow the instructions. On this farm, we see the 2 boxes on either side, and each one of them has 10 nipples per pen, and they have 2 barrels inside of these insulated boxes, and there are pumps on a timer that keep it agitated. And the person that's running this has a real commitment to sanitation and consistency, getting a high rate of intake. Weaning can be a little bit of a challenge on these, but again, it takes the right person, and I think you can see in this scenario it's a very nice looking setup. So we can finish up looking at the calf auto feeders. The Forster Technic Company sells these in the U.S., and they're through DeLaval, GEA, and Lely. They're all very similar. There's some little differences in software. The other one that we'll see in the U.S. is Home Wow, and then Urban, and then there's a more fundamental auto feeder that we've seen at least in Virginia and parts of the Southeast, that works a little bit better on some of the smaller dairies. That's called the Biotic, and has been successfully used. And some rules about this: we try and limit the calves per nipple to probably 20. I've seen this a little bit higher, but we can establish feeding plans, and I'll show you this to you on the next slide. At the amount of milk, we can get that machine to mix up the concentration of that powder very consistently, and we can set minimum and maximum meal sizes. And I want to focus on the minimum. We don't want these calves going back to drink very frequent small meals, so we set our minimum meal size for about 1 to 1.5 liters, and it's all going to be in metric. So if this calf is allocated 6 liters per day, we use about a 20-hour day because we consider we have some downtime. Well, this calf will earn a credit of about 0.3 of a liter per hour. So if we have a minimum meal size of 1.5 liters, he or she's going to have to wait about 5 hours to earn the right to get a meal out of that feeder, and that feeder will mix it up in 0.5 liter at a time, and until it reaches the maximum. So we don't let them to have a large meal. So these calves can get frequent meals of a little bit smaller size than we've been feeding if we were feeding just twice a day. Here's a feeding plan, and just to explain a little bit, we've got several periods here. So if this calf is coming into this feeder for the first 3 days, this calf is allowed to drink 6 liters a day. The next 10 days, it ramps up from 6 to 8. The next 25 days from 8 to 10. And then the last 10 days, we wean it over 10 days by dropping this down a little bit each day from 10 to 2.5 liters. We've controlled the concentration, and that's 150 grams added to 1,000 mils of water. So that's not 50%. It's 15%. It's 150 divided by 1150. So this is about a 13% solids, just like we have in milk. And then we have our meal sizes. And one of the things to point out is that these animals get larger. We can make a larger meal size, and these can go up to 3 or 3.5 liters. What happens? The young calves will drink smaller meals. And as that calf gets older, they'll tend to drop from maybe 5, 6, 7 meals a day to 3 or 4, but much larger meals. Some of these feeders will let you feed pasteurized milk. Some will let you blend waste milk and powder and water for a consistent solids level. So if you know you have about this much waste milk or pasteurized milk, you can add powder and water to supplement that. And a lot of the machines will have a mixer cleaning, which cleans the internal workings, and we'll do that several times a day. And then there's a circuit clean that's pretty much like a CIP that we have with the milking system, where we disconnect the milk hoses and clean the nipples manually, and then the rest of it goes through a circuit clean. So they do a pretty good job of sanitizing those. So I want to kind of finish up this thing with the automatic calf feeders of talking about a study that again was done at the University of British Columbia, and that's using automated feeders to wean calves fed large amounts of milk. So smaller groups, 5 to 9, they were put on the auto feeders from 5 to 6 days of age. They were offered 12 liters of pasteurized milk a day. Now that doesn't mean they drank it, but they were allowed to drink that much. They got ad lib starter and hay. They had a group that was started to wean at 40 days and were weaned by 48. Another group that was late weaned, in other words, they weren't weaned until 80 days and were completed by 89. And then there was a group that was weaned by starter intake, and as it hit 200 grams of starter intake a day and the machine was measuring that, it would gradually reduce their milk intake. So what did we see here? Well, the point that I want to show is that we're looking at a measure that's really very useful and I think has some great merits on these auto feeders, and that's looking at unrewarded visits. And that indicates hunger. What it means is that calf has gone to the feeder and wants a meal, but they're not allowed to get a meal because of some of the rules that we have set. In the case of this study, and I want to focus more on this weaning group, if we look at those early weaned calves, they're 40 days of age, they're still pretty hungry, okay? They're still pretty hungry, so they're making a lot of unrewarded visits. In fact, in this case, about 17 to 18 visits a day to try and get more milk as compared to the 10 to 12 for those weaned by starter intake. And as we've weaned them the week after, they're really pretty ticked off. And that doesn't start dropping down until after that second week after weaning. Now, is that a stress on those cows? Undoubtedly it is, and I think that's something that we may want to try and minimize. As a side note, this unrewarded visits is also something that we're looking at as an indicator of animal health. What we see on these automatic calf feeders, the unrewarded visits go down as that calf doesn't feel quite as good. And that's one of our first indicators of poor health on these calves. A lot of them will eat their meal, but you'll see a increase in that or decrease in that unrewarded visits. They just don't have that drive to eat, and that's can be a useful measure. If we look at then body weights of these calves weaned early, late, and by starter intake, and again, as expected, we see these late weaned calves. They've been getting milk for a longer period of time. At 10 weeks of age, they're weighing 10 kilos more, almost 20 pounds more. So they're growing a whole lot better, and the same thing is true with these ones weaned on starter intake, and that is significantly different. Now, if we look at 12 or 13 weeks, those differences start dropping off, and it is significant at the 0.07, 0.09, but not as meaningful as we have with these younger animals. So as we look at the next slide, and I think this is about what you would expect, we're feeding a lot more milk to these late weaned calves. A lot more milk, and less so the ones on the starter intake. These have increased their starter intake quite a bit. Don't see too much difference in hay intake. And really over the study, our digestible energy intakes are really not statistically different. Not statistically different. Now, what they found is during weaning, the early weaning calves had more unrewarded visits. They were hungry. All the late weaning and all the starter weaning calves gained weight during weaning. They didn't have that growth check. This early weaning on these calves were the ones that we wound up with a growth check. There was a large variation. I think this is something really important and interesting when calves started eating starter. Tremendous on any of the studies. There's just a lot of variation, and just like people, calves have a lot of variability in terms of what they would prefer. I think there's some potential for automated starter feeding coupled to weaning. I think we're not quite there yet. What I have seen in the field is some of these, some of these automated starter feeding, they make a little bit too much noise. So the calf comes in, it started making noise, and they'll back up, and I think it delays that starter intake a little bit. But I think we're going to be there in the future. We're going to be there in the future. So our observations, and this is personal opinion on auto feeders, service and support's important. Getting the right feeding plan in there, designing a facility. There's some great information coming from the Dairyland Initiative. Having a dealer who's going to service and install that equipment. You've got to clean it, and that means cleaning and washing the stalls. This calf is sticking their nose into an area where there's a potential for contamination. Setting up that automated cleaning for 3 to 4 times a day. We have to have great colostrum management, calving and management. I know a lot of veterinarians are just really concerned about these systems, but when they're managed well, I've seen them be very, very successful. We got to feed about 7 liters of milk per day too. If you're going to feed less than that, you're going to have a lot of stress amongst these calves because they just really want more milk. I'd love to spend more time here, but animal welfare is a big consideration. Not only just from the viewpoint of the calves. I think when you look at some of these calves in group housing situations, it warms your heart. They're running around, they're playing. The picture over in the lower right-hand corner of some of our calves at Virginia Tech, it's a real different animal. You walk into the barn and it doesn't really mean much to these calves as compared to when they're fed twice a day. We may think that calf hutches are a really great thing for calves, but a consumer perception of that might be very different. I think this is an area of very, very active research that's being pursued at various locations around the country. Well, I'm going to finish up by kind of summarizing some things and again getting back to critical control points. And that's colostrum management. You've got to have it right. And as I've worked with farms, I think we need to back up and look at our facilities. The idea that we have cows calving in a remote location and we're going to truck them to the farm and their calf and milk them is probably not in our best interest. We need to have the right people that are involved in the right location. We've got to take care of each thing along that step involved in colostrum management. If we don't do that right, we're going to be struggling always with these calves. And unfortunately, there are no silver bullets that are going to help us out there. We need to feed the calves to meet their nutrient requirements for growth. These are babies, okay? If we fed our children like that, they'd probably put us in jail. We need to feed their nutrient requirements, and this first couple of weeks, they're not eating very much starter. And the idea that we're going to limit feed them to encourage them to eat dry feed is just not biologically normal. we need to focus on energy and protein intake. Those are the primary considerations, and high quality energy and protein. And I think that is extremely important. And finally, we need some facilities to minimize disease risk. This is probably one of the epitomes of calf facilities that I've seen. Well-bedded straw, pens with straw, excellent ventilation in here. We've minimized the maintenance expense on these calves. We've minimized the stress on these calves. The other thing we need to look at is we need to improve labor efficiency and comfort. And I think that's one of the big potential advantages of some of these excuse me, group housing situations, in that we can really improve that tremendously for our labor as well as for our calves. And I think we're learning some things about social development of these calves, and maybe that can have some really long-lasting benefits of this. So at this point, I guess I would welcome questions. I want to come back and thank our sponsors, DeLaval. I've really appreciated their support of this and their support of the auto feeders. I want to appreciate Hordes Dairyman for their excellent work, and both Steve and Dr. Hutchins for really pioneering, I think, some excellent educational activities. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, Dr. James, thank you very much for a great presentation. You did a wonderful job of kind of refreshing us on some of the basics, and it's interesting how new research and new farm and field observations are tweaking some of the things that we were raised on as far as individual housing, lots of developments like that, and how we feed, of course, the replacers and so forth. Very interesting, very well done. We appreciate it very much, and of course, again, we appreciated the support of DeLaval. Just a note here, looking ahead, fine-tuning transition cow care will be the topic of our September webinar. It's going to be led by Dr. Phil Cardoso at the University of Illinois, with sponsorship by Angiomoto Heartland. And looking a little bit further ahead, our co-host Mike Hutchins, teaming up with hay and forage grower editor Mike Rankin for a feed supply outlook, and that's going to be sponsored by Zinpro. Another note before we get to the questions, the webinars, this webinar and all the others will be, of course, are available on our archives for viewing, reviewing, or recommendations to friends, colleagues, so forth, co-workers. So be sure to check out our archives. Those of you who are with us live today, well over 100 people plus, will be receiving a survey, a very short survey here in a couple of days, and we sure appreciate your response to completing those answers to help us with our webinar series. So, with those comments, Dr. Mike Hutchins, what about the speed round, as you call it, the questions? Are you ready to go?
You bet, Bob. Are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Okay,
here's your first question. You mentioned flash freezing damages white blood cells. What about rapid cooling down to 35 degrees? Is there any risk of damaging antibodies or anything like that, dropping the temperature quickly to 35?
Probably not as much so. Now, I have to admit that I'm not a cellular biologist, but we're probably not going to disrupt that. Now, I think some of that depends on how long we're going to be storing that colostrum in a refrigerated form, and again, the longer it's being stored, the less likelihood that we're going to have any lasting impact of those white blood cells on that calf.
Okay, another question. If the calves are not drinking the 6 quarts of milk in that first weaning in the first 3 weeks of life due to unfinished bottles, would it be beneficial then to put the remaining milk into an esophageal feeder and tube that calf during that time period, the remaining milk after the 6 quarts that are there?
That is one excellent question, and I'm glad it was asked, because absolutely not. Now, we tube colostrum to calves if they don't drink it. And what happens is that colostrum, a fair amount of that's going to go into the rumen, but at this stage with these calves, it's really not that much of an impact. If we tube milk to an older calf, that milk is going to go into, a fair amount of it's going to go into the rumen, then further on down the track, and it's going to ferment and really create an undesirable fermentation and situation from that calf, and we can wind up with some acidosis. So in those situations, if that calf is not drinking, do we want to tube it with milk? In those scenarios, if we're tubing calf, get a high quality electrolyte that's got some dextrose or glucose into it. We don't want to use any sucrose, no table sugar, anything like that, but really utilizing a high quality electrolyte, and that can help us to give some energy to that calf. But in no situation should we tube a calf with milk if they're not going to be consuming it after that first day of age, or that first feeding.
Very good. Is it possible that the higher number of unrewarded visits have more to do with a quick weaning on these calves from, say, 20 liters weaning in 7 to 8 days? Even if the same protocol at 80 days, weaning at 8 days is quite a bit shorter when offering the only 12 liters. Comments?
Yeah, when you're looking at high levels of milk, they're kind of spoiled. And so these calves are really getting ramped up to drinking a large volume of milk, and it's in the South we call it living in tall cotton, but it's the good life. And then all of a sudden, if we're going to take that away from them, we're dealing with a very different biological situation. You look at that 80-day weaned calf, and we haven't increased that milk anymore, but we're dealing with a substantially larger calf. I mean, it was 20 pounds different in body weight. And so they've already probably shifted over to starting to consume some calf starter. And so, yeah, I think we're dealing with that 40-day weaning with a calf maybe that's just, particularly with a higher level of milk intake, that's just not really ready for weaning, and that's our scenario.
Okay, a very short question here. Esophageal feeder or nipple, which one is better?
Yeah, that's one we can argue forever. And when you look at the research, if we tube a calf with an esophageal feeder, 4 quarts, we're going to see very acceptable levels of IgG or the antibodies in the blood. And so the research would say, hey, it really doesn't matter. I guess as a calf feeder, and I've fed my own calves, and what would I rather do? I'd much rather have somebody feed that in a nipple. It's a little bit more biologically normal. When we feed it with the esophageal feeder, some of that's going to go in the rumen. How many of you have consumed a gallon of liquid in one sitting, or at least having somebody force that upon you? And it's a stress. It's a stress on that calf. However, we reach those scenarios where a calf is too weak to drink. Some of them are rather stubborn, and it comes down to a matter of time, and it's a judgment decision. For me, I prefer at least giving the attempt at bottle feeding, and if that doesn't work, if that's necessary, then we use the esophageal feeder. But I understand totally the viewpoint of some that say, hey, we're just going to use the esophageal feeder because then I know it got in there. In some scenarios, you can make a mistake, and you can fill the lungs up with some fluid, and then that's a real undesirable situation. That's rare, and again, with employees and people that are properly trained, it's extremely rare, but it does happen. And so everything involves risks, and it's a matter of weighing those risks on your situation as to what the best decision's going to be. And I have my own prejudices, and mine's always to start with the nipple, and if that doesn't work, then I'm going to use the esophageal feeder. You got to clean that esophageal feeder too. We've looked at some bacteria counts on some of those, and they can get pretty high. And so it's very important that we follow some very strict sanitation protocols if we're going to use the esophageal feeder.
Okay, Bob, another question. Does pasteurization kill leukosis? You could also look at mycoplasma and things like that as well. Comments on what does the pasteurization kill?
Again, a properly designed and operating pasteurizer will kill leukosis, will kill mycoplasma. I guess the one that you worry more about is the Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. The Ionis is probably a lot more heat resistant. All the commercial pasteurizers that are out there are really quite effective. My point is that you've got to monitor it. If you're going to use a pasteurizer, and again, it depends on how much risk you're willing to accept. You know, if it was my farm, I'd run a bacteria count on that pasteurizer on a weekly basis. And again, people will tell me, oh, there's no bacteria growing. No, you've diluted it enough to where you didn't catch anything. And so we're looking at, for colostrum, a minimum and bacteria count of about 50,000, standard plate count. And for milk, if we're feeding that, I want it less than 20,000. And I can tell you that I've worked with producers who do that day in and day out and are very, very successful because they've got great protocols and they really stay on top of their pasteurizers, and they've been very, very successful. And I've seen others where they've been fooling themselves because even though it goes through the pasteurizer, something has not been operating correctly, and they've been, as I say, they've been fooling themselves on that.
Okay, another quick question. What is the longest you would store colostrum? I assume we're referring to refrigerated, and maybe we could even expand that to frozen colostrum. Any guidelines on that, Bob, assuming you bring the temperature down quickly, as you mentioned?
Yep. Well, I think the biggest thing is the contamination that you have on that colostrum to begin with. What is it? You know, coming out of the cow, it's very, very low in bacteria count. And then what kind of container do we put it into, and that really determines how long we can keep that cool and how quickly we cool it. You know, I've seen places where they do a wonderful job of collecting it. It goes into a clean container, but then they stick it in the refrigerator and allow it to try and cool on its own. Well, it's going to take somewhere between 6 and 9 hours, particularly if it's in a large volume, to get down to less than 40 degrees. And so there's a lot of what ifs on how quickly that, you know, personally, I think you get beyond 2 days, 2 to 3 days, I think a real deterioration in quality on that, and it's a risk I'm not willing to take in those scenarios. And I worked with a farm in California where they had probably some of the best protocols I've ever seen. We did a study with about 85 calves on this farm, and we had 2 calves out of that 85 that had a failure of passive transfer. And I credit that to their excellent protocols that they had on keeping clean devices and cooling that stuff as quickly as they possibly can if they were not going to feed it. And their protocols were phenomenal, and I think their success really showed it.
We'll take one more quick question, and that relates back to the formic acid. Could you use citric acid instead of formic acid since it's not legal in the U.S.? Or when you mention organic acids, do you have any favorite ones?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to plead a little bit of ignorance. I know citric is one of them. Generally, they tend to be some combination of acids, and I really can't tell you right offhand. A lot of the major milk replacer companies have found combinations that work well with them. I know when I was a graduate student, we tried to use propionic acid by itself, and the calves really didn't like that very much at all. The palatability was just not there. But most of the major milk replacer companies that are making some of this are using some combinations, and I know citric is potentially one of those.
Well, needless to say, Bob, you've caused lots of great questions to come in here. Steve, let's turn the program back to you, and you can kind of wind us up for today.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and again, Dr. Bob James, thank you so much for a great job, very well done, and we appreciate the sponsorship deal, of course. Thank you, Mike Hutchins, for your co-hosting skills again, as always, and your partner down there, Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois, also. So we thank all of you who are still with us today. We had a very nice audience out there. We appreciate your participation. Want to just mention again, transition cows coming up on September 12th. Dr. Phil Cardoso, University of Illinois, sponsorship will be on Anjimoto. Hartland, and then a feed supply outlook. Dr. Mike Hutchins and Mike Rankin, sponsored by Zinpro, will be the topic of our October 10 webinar. So thanks again. That's Steve Larson up here at Dairyman signing off and thanking you again, and hope to have you back with us at future webinars.